Okay, we're going live here shortly. This is going to be the live, unedited version. Welcome back to Real Cast Fishing. Your host, Glenn, with the City of Adam Fishing Field Team, COAF Field Team on YouTube. In this round, what have I got for you? Well, we're talking more on the Little Red Book of Fly Fishing, specifically part 2 of the book. In the case of part 1, excuse me, I was focusing more on the fly cast. In part 2, it's looking at presentation, especially looking at 61 tips that are included in part 2. And yours truly is going to go through tips 46 through 50 this round. And then we'll just see where it takes us. All right, so let's go ahead and start. Presentation, 61 tips to help you place and drift your flies so that trout want to eat them. When we talk about presentation, we're talking about the most crucial element of fly fishing. How does the fly look to a trout in the instance before it decides to eat it or not? Granted, with brains the sizes of marbles, trout aren't terribly deep thinkers, but they are critics to the extent that instinct tells them what looks natural and what does not. Most of the time, but not always, trout only eat things that look natural to them, especially in the fly fishing arena. Excuse me. My best antidote that puts the whole fly fishing or fly presentation issue into perspective is a saltwater fishing story. I was working in the flats with Bill Curtis, a legend among South Florida fly guides, and we saw a big permit cruise into the shallows. I have no idea how big the fish really was. Suffice it to say it looked like a metal trash can lid shimmering under the surface. There's a little picture. And then right into the next section here of that same channel, or same section, tip 45. Just the intro to the chapter. I made what I thought was a perfect cast, about 60 feet, slightly leading the fish, with the fly landing about 5 feet past the permit. I made a few strips of the line to skip my crab fly along the bottom, and of what I thought would be the zone. The permit finned away, more annoyed than spooked. What went wrong? I asked. I made a great cast. I didn't line the fish. Bill picked up his push pole and grumbled down at me on the deck. Fish aren't used to their food attacking them. Good point. Apply that thinking to all your fly fishing, especially trout fishing. An insect, be it a nymph floating under the surface or a dun trying its wings on the surface, is usually moving, at the mercy of the current. Let me take a break here. For those on the podcast, I have a Shinerbach beer. And it's tasty. All right. I just got to clear the throat. Getting a little dry here. Okay. Is usually moving at the mercy of the current. An emerging insect is swimming toward the surface. Bait fish that senses a predatory trout in its vicinity will swim nervously away from the fish. So the trick with presentation is to make flies act how they're designed to look. Dead drift nymphs with the current, with no drag, make spinners fall from the sky and almost lifeless on the surface, and swim your streamers. There are a few times when the rules can be bent. Twitch a grasshopper near a cut bank, dead drift a woolly bugger through a deep run, fish dry flies wet, fish wet flies dry, and so on. But by and large, if you present your flies in a way that make them behave as naturally as possible, all the while keeping your presence as stealthily and blended into the environment as possible, you've discovered the number one secret to fly fishing success. Whether you can cast 20 feet or 120 feet, and whether you have a spot-on matching fly pattern or an old generic standard, what happens in the first seconds after that fly hits the water matters most. Always. All right, so that's a good to know for opener for part 2, talking the fly presentation. And I like what they're saying about that last or first seconds of the fly hitting the water. And then that example of individual fishing to some permit and the fly fishing guide noting that they're not used to their food attacking them. So good info here. All right, so that takes us into the first tip in the part 2. It's tip 46. And I'll start reading. The dead drift. When you're dry fly fishing, a good presentation always starts with a good drift. And a good drift is usually a dead drift, meaning the fly is traveling in exact connection with the current. I once walked up on a guide friend and his client on a gorgeous Colorado afternoon, a day when insects were swarming and the fish were happy. What are they eating? I asked. A good drift, he smiled. And to prove the point, he showed me the size 14 Royal Trude this guy was fishing with. I'd seen a lot of bugs that day, but nothing that looked quite like that. Bear with me. Sorry. The secret to a good drift is casting upstream and letting your fly float with the current. Drag when the fly is caught, or fly line is caught by the current, causing tension that moves the fly unnaturally, and micro drag when the leader does the same thing, will inevitably turn off the fish. Try to keep as little fly line on the water as possible. When the fly is moving from upstream down at straight tangent, drag is less of a concern. But when you are casting at an angle to the current, keeping the line off the water is smart. Failing, always keep the fly line upstream from the flies. So, dead drift. That's a key thing there. Just make sure that when you are fishing, that you're able to, have that drag-free drift. So keep that in your back pocket. Tip 46, dead drift. 47, high stick nymphing. The value of a good dead drift applies to a nymph fishing, especially when you use a method called high stick nymphing, as opposed to European or short line nymphing. With high stick nymphing, you typically fish 2 flies below a split shot, each element separated by about a foot of tippet material. Fasten a strike indicator to your leader a few feet above the weight. The idea is that the weight drops to the bottom of a river. The fly is trailed delicately behind, and when a fish grabs a fly, the indicator will tell you by way of a subtle dip or stall on the surface. Dead drifting your flies, first letting them settle into the run, and as they pass your position, remembering to keep the line upstream from the indicator is the trick to making it all, to make this all work. Sorry. To make this all work. Son KD, Kevin Dieter, or Kirk Dieter. Okay, another one, high nymphing. There's talking about a difference between short nymphing or Euro nymphing versus the high nymph, and talking of the strike indicator. And it does make a difference. And I do like the one video that Hank Patterson put out about the most important thing about setting the hook is if it wiggles, it jiggles, it does whatever, looks like anything's making it move, you set the hook. Well, I think that applies here as well. When you're doing a high stick nymphing and you're using that indicator, you see or sense something's going to hit it, I'll set that hook. All right. Okay. Let's see if I can take us on to the next item. This is tip 48, the whole 9 feet, as opposed to the whole 9 yards. Let me begin. Have you ever wondered why most fly rods are longer than conventional spinning rods? It's because that added length helps you control, cast, and tend your line effectively. So why do I see so many people mend their line with forceful strokes or try to roll cast from hip level? Because they don't know what they are doing? Point the rod tip high in the air when you mend your line. It doesn't take a mighty whip of the line to mend. In fact, whipping the line is the worst thing you can do to your drift. Line it, lift it, and lay it down gently. It's amazing what can happen when you use a full rod length to do what's designed to do. When you want to roll cast, think about using the rod tip as leverage. Often the higher you lift, the further you roll. The one exception to higher is better mode of thinking happens after you've made a good cast, you've mended your line, and your flies are floating perfectly to run. At that point, I want you to keep the rod flat or parallel to the water. Why? Because when the rod is flat above the water line all it takes is a gentle flick of the wrist to set the hook. When you drift your flies with the rod tip pointed at the sky, you have no leverage on the fish and no means to find the resistance necessary to set the hook unless you yank the rod over your shoulder. Use the length of the rod to your advantage. When you cast and mend, keep the tip high. Lift in place. When you drift and set the hook, keep the tip lower. Use all 9 feet every time, every cast, every mend, and every drift. Signed, KD. All right, so I like that one. Tip 48. Use the whole 9 feet. All right, let's go on to tip 49, mending your ways. Mending, the art of tossing a bend in your line as a hedge against drag, is an essential element for effective drifts. The trick is knowing when and how much. Anglers make 2 basic mistakes: mending too aggressively and not often enough. A powerful sweeping mend while nymphing has a negative effect of lifting the fly off the bottom, often during the sweep bottom of the drift. Try to gauge how to mend the line with minimal movement of the fly. With a shorter line, this often can be achieved simply by lifting the rod tip to place the line in the desired position. Several short mends that don't disturb the fly are better than one big one. Generally, the best time to mend is just before you think you really need it. All right, and then in the for those that are listening, I'll describe, there's an illustration of an individual who is mending line. He's perpendicular to the current in a river, and it's just showing basically him lifting the rod and the line to mend it. All right, so that was tip 49, mending your ways. Okay, let's go. This is going to be the last one for this round, number 50. Finding your mark. Since even the slightest drag can spoil the presentation of a dry fly, it's important to know when this occurs. The best way to know if your fly is moving too fast is to mark another object in the immediate vicinity: a leaf, an air bubble, an insect. If your fly is keeping pace, you're in business. Moving too fast, then it's time to make amend. So this one, finding your mark, it reminds me of when I'm fishing a river and whatnot. I am drifting and I'm watching my presentation, the line, or in this case, a strike indicator. I tend to follow the bubbles that pop up along the river as the water is flowing by. And as long as my strike indicator is following that bubble line, not passing it, it's in concert with it, I tend to notice that excuse me, I get better hits that way, or better strikes. So finding your mark, tip 50, just keep in mind, basically talking of a drift and making sure that you are along that drift and using something to mark that that rate of drift in that particular river. In this case, you suggest a leaf, an air bubble, an insect. All right. Okay, so that was tips 46 through 50, part 2 of the Red Book of Fly Fishing. And in this one, they again focus more on fly presentation versus part 1 was the fly casting. All right, let me take a little sip of my Shunnerbock. Yes. Okay. At this point, I usually just talk about some questions, answers, or recent event. And really, they haven't had much questions lately. I think it's because it's the beginning of the year. Plus, well, we've got this Arctic front or blast that's going to be coming down and dropping temperatures in the area. So some of us may be bundling up a little bit here. But that said, excuse me, I did post a YouTube shorts of a past trip where I was doing some striped bass fly fishing at the local tail race, Denison Dam, just up the road from us here from the city of Allen. And that was a fun trip. I was using a switch rod and different flies, specifically the Clouser minnow, as well as the Bennett's Lunch and a Crafter minnow, Clouser minnow. And I was catching striped bass, white bass, and pretty much just having a good old time, enjoying the tail race when there wasn't much current, and luckily I was able to fish that section without having to worry about falling in the water and whatnot. So it's a YouTube Shorts, but someone had asked about the long form content of it, and I did have that, and I posted previously, and so I linked it with the YouTube Shorts, so you should be able to see that video. But that said, I went ahead and connected it to this live stream, and I'm going to bring it up here. And for those that are listening on the podcast, I'll just describe what the video is showing. All right, so bear with me. Oops, that's not the one. I need to redirect this video, so bear with me. I'll just describe what I'm doing. I'm just going to take me to, let's see, downloads, and it's this one. Okay. All right. Here I am just talking about this particular trip, and I'll just skip that and take us to the river. All right, this is Denison Dam, the tail race. You can see that they're not generating. And in this case, I'm just describing what I'm seeing. I'm looking, in particular, the different pools and deeper sections and runs for looking for any activity. And at this point, there was a lot of, I guess, carp, but there were striped bass, there were white bass, even some of these smaller bass were in there. And they hadn't, let me think. They hadn't started generating, I think it was the night before, and then they picked up generation later in the morning. But I got there first thing about 7 in the morning. Was able to fish a good 3-4 hours before they started generating power. All right. And so those listening on the podcast, there's a view of the river. I'm just walking down one of the stairwells, headed to the river itself. I've got some wading gear on. Got the switch rod, and I'm just pointing out some rocks and areas to keep in mind as I make my way through there. Okay. And let's see, here I'm working a particular spot. In fact, this is the spot where I end up staying for most of the trip. And what I'm doing is I'm working a little pool or deeper section by this rock, but I am going to start moving up to that rock that I just showed earlier and position myself there and pretty much spend the rest of the time fishing from that location. All right. One thing that I do keep with me when I'm doing this, I'll have my wading gear. I'll have a wading stick, and it looks like that was a scale of a gar or some large fish that I just picked up, and then I start fishing. And here I'm just using, it's an 11.5 foot switch rod. I'm using it one-handed, but you can also use it two-handed. And here I'm catching a few fish now. So they wanted movement. In this case, I was using what's called the Denison Dam Dauber. All right. It's one that I saw some folks put together over the years, and it looked like, well, I think it's like a Clouser minnow, but then it has some chenille that goes over the dumbbell, the lead dumbbell eyes. All right, but I've got a striper now. Now I'll go cast again. I'm just kind of working that area again. And now I'm just adjusting either for distance to get it a little bit further down the run. And then I'm also adjusting the presentation. In this case, I'm using a 10 count. So I'm letting the fly drop about 10. I count the 10, and then I'll start the retrieve. And in this case, I'm doing a pretty fast retrieve, and I sense that the bass or the striped bass are really hungry that morning, and they are just wanting to go tear up some bait or some fish and have a little breakfast or something, you know. All right. So I've got another one on the line. It went consistent like that over the course of the morning. One thing about Denison Dam is the Red River rules, Oklahoma. So there's no size limit. It's only just a quantity. I think it's max 5 for the daily limit. Excuse me. Sorry. Got a little coughing fit here. Okay. And then additionally, some things to keep in mind when you're fishing Oklahoma. is that you have to have a separate stringer that's marked and tagged with your name and fishing license or customer number. One of the regulations or one of the rules in Oklahoma is to have that separate stringer. So if you and a buddy are out there, you're going to have each have a stringer of to hold your fish. And additionally, it's not just Denison Dam. It's also pretty much any tail race in Oklahoma in the first 1,000 feet. But check the regs; they may have changed it and whatnot. Okay, so I continue on. Again, that fast retrieve seems to be working. I do start changing my fishing flies. I'll start with that Denison Dam Dauber. I'll switch over to a craft fur minnow, Clouser minnow. I'll switch over to a traditional deer hair Clouser minnow. And then at one point, I'll switch over to the Bennett's Lunch. It's the Bennett's Lunch that I picked up when I was down in Green, over there, New Braunfels, Guadalupe River, fishing that area. There's a fly shop there that I pick up the Bennett's Lunch there. That seems to be a really good pattern for me. And hey, don't knock on wood. Don't mess with the streak. If those fishing flies are working for you, well, definitely keep using them. All right. All right. And again, in the video, and for those listening on the podcast, I'll just describe. I'm doing that fast retrieve, catching in this case these little stripers, maybe 10 to 12 inch. In this case, this one I just released was a one caught on a Clouser minnow. Let's see. This is again just kind of working the river, and I'm using that 10 count. I think I do adjust it to like a 5 or 6 count later. But for the most part, I let it sink and then I start the retrieve. At one point, as I get close to the end of the retrieve, I'll stop doing that fast pull of the fly line, and I'll start sweeping the rod from left to right just to maintain the speed or that action on the fishing fly as it gets closer, because I'm running out of room, and if I keep pulling line, I'm going to bring that fly all the way up to the end of the tip of my rod. So instead, I'll just kind of sweep it without taking any more line, and at times I'll get strikes just basically right at the length of my fly rod, if not shorter than that, with these little stripers. Let's see. Later on, it will pick up with some larger stripers, and I do enjoy that point. In fact, I did get, I think, one nice size striped bass. It was during the November, I think, of one year. Cold winter, but the fish were biting, so I went for it. Not sure how it is this time of year, especially with this big Arctic blast that's blowing through here. They may kind of stay quiet or dormant, I guess. Just to play by ear. All right, so that's pretty much it with the video or what I did during that day. Let me see if I can jump over and skip around a little. Yeah, here's some more. This is where I'm switched out to a pink Denison Dauber, and then here this is a craft fur Clouser minnow. Very simple tie. Using about a size 2 saltwater hook. Easily can hold a nice size fish or two with that heavy bend or heavy metal in that hook. All right, got another one coming in here shortly. So overall, it was a fun time hitting Denison Dam that time of year. All right, and then go ahead and keep flipping through. All right, yeah, more little guys. I think this may be a white bass. Oh no, it's a striped bass. More of the short pulls. Now some stop and go retrieve. So short pull, stop. Here's a little twitchy thing that I'm doing. So what happened there is I noticed I could see the striped bass coming right at the fly and then turning away. And then I noticed if I could just dip my rod tip in the water and do that last twitch or pull, keep that fly down further in the water column, I was able to get these guys to continue on and striking. And then here's a view of just the rock I was fishing, just kind of working that area, this run. I pretty much stayed there all day and was able to just have a good old time. This time of year, didn't have to bring any wading gear. I was wet wading, just having some wading boots on. All right. And yeah, it got pretty hot, but it was pretty fun. All right. And this is again, what I'm doing here is again just sweeping that rod from left to right as I get at the tail end of the retrieve, and trying to keep as much time of that fly in the water for those striped bass to strike. And then here's where I'm doing a fast retrieve. You can see the short pulls that are just consistent. Now I'm slowed down, and at the tail end of the retrieve, I had one take doing that sweep from left to right. And now I just recast it. I'm just going to see if I can get this guy. I know he's just over here, less than 10, 15 feet away in this pool. And all I'm doing is just kind of dragging my rod and kind of twitching it and whatnot, keeping that fly in the zone where the fish are lurking. And sure enough, I got one. All right. And it's pretty fun, I tell you what. And with that switch rod, I have the opportunity to fish it one-handed, and then I have the opportunity to fish it two-handed. Just depends on what cast I need. If I really need to get it out there, I'll do a spay cast with the two-handed style. But most times I just use it one-handed. As I took up switch casting because I hurt my shoulder one year, and I found out that if I could keep my my elbow and my hand below my shoulder, I could still fish. It's just I needed to have a rod and a technique to keep fishing without having to lift up. And what I found was with the switch rod, I could do a roll cast, a switch cast, and then later on just whatever cast. And I was able to recover from my little shoulder injury after about 3-4 months, but I didn't have to stop fishing. So yeah, that's why I took up switch casting, or fishing with a switch rod. All right. And of course, I continue on doing that today. Switch rod as well as this other different rods. But here again, fishing my switch rod one-handed, taking out a bunch of line, kind of working it in there. I just shot it back out again, and I'll just prep for the next cast. In this case, I'm letting it drift down river and letting them strike at that point, because there was several cases where I think I caught or foul hooked a shad on my clouser, and I went ahead and just let it drift down, and next thing I know, a fish took it. So after that, I started doing that with the clouser and just let it drift down with the current without any twitchy movements and whatnot. And I did get several strikes that way. So hey, sometimes you got to mix it up when you're out there if they kind of switch the pattern on you. All right. So, oh yeah. So I'm hoping to again do this this upcoming spring, summer. Really enjoy that time down there. I would say spring, summer's really good. Later on in the fall, it's really good too. But you gotta play it by ear with the lake turnover. When you start getting that milky sulfur smell, lake's turning over, you still might be able to get a fish or two, but it gets really tough. So, all right. So with that, this was the episode 4, Little Red Book of Fly Fishing, went through tips 46 through 50, part 2 of the Little Red Book of Fly Fishing. We'll come back and do some more. I'm doing them in sections of about 5, and the format I've been using is go through the book, read, put some topics or some key points out of them, and then switching over to Q&A. In this case, the Q&A was a request to take a look at the long form video of a YouTube short that I just posted today. And this is it right here. It's the trip I took to Denison Dam one year fishing the tail race with a switch rod. All right, and I do have a link to that YouTube short and the related video link. You can get to this video, and you should be good to go to get a feel for what I did that day. This is probably one of those really good days when you're just on the river. There was really only one other person there fishing, and it was pretty much pretty cool having a fish alone by yourself without anyone else bothering you. A little white bass in this case. I did have to cut the trip short around 11 o'clock, 11:30, because that's when they started generating again. All right. So with that, let me go and shift over to the intro section. Okay. All right. So I hope y'all check back. This is the Real Cast Fishing podcast. This is the live, unedited version where I just do it live. Later on, I'll repost it on the podcast, and it'll just be streamed. It'll be the audio version. So with that, all for now. Appreciate y'all joining today. And next time we'll catch y'all later. And good luck and good fishing.